Okay, I think we're hitting critical mass. There's so many slides in this presentation, so I am going to get us started. Again, this is a presentation from Akur8 Academy. This is like the thought leadership arm of Akur8. It's titled The Modeler's Edge, Philosophy and Principles for Building Superior Models. And we'll have a Q&A section at the end. There should be some Q&A functionality when you log in that you can submit questions. You can put those in as they come up. You don't need to wait until the end. But I will try to get to those at the end. So my name is Max Martinelli. I'm an actuarial data scientist here at Akur8. I'm out of our American office. And so today I want to present on some topics related to modeling, specifically stochasticity. So this is the idea that the nature of our world is statistical and it's unpredictable. And that goes into our next one, prediction, right? So most of us are in the business of prediction, and so, or we're trying to get into it, and we're trying to use these tools that we have to account for the stochastic nature. But it's really an ode to the modeler, right? And I feel a little goofy for including this because, it is a bit of a strange slide, but really it is getting at the crux of what this presentation is about. I believe in human ingenuity, and I think in this age of artificial intelligence and machine learning, the modeler still offers an edge. And that human ingenuity is what's going to empower us to use these tools, but to build better models. So I start this presentation with a paper from an information theorist named Shannon. I think this paper came out in the 50s. And what this paper was titled was the bandwagon. And it was about how information theory, which was at the time a cutting edge discipline within computer science and kind of machine learning at the time, there was so much hype around it. It was just so hyped up. And while it was making incredible advances, there was the potential for us never to live up to the hype, and that actually tended to be true, right? So this was a very consequential innovation, but it just never delivered on all the promises that people were making for it. And so you'd actually be surprised, this is what was assigned to me in my deep learning course. You can see where my professor's head was at with this idea. But there's so much hype right now. What is real, and like what can we realistically deliver? And so I maybe want to zoom out and say, not information theory, not deep learning, but just artificial intelligence, machine learning in general. There was a more recent paper, which is actually really interesting. I don't have time to go into all of it today, but it was titled Thousands of AI Authors on the Future of AI. And it was kind of a collection and summarization of survey results. What was really interesting about this paper was that it had the results from 2023 as well as 2022. So we got to see how these things changed. And give me a moment to explain these visualizations. These come straight from the paper. But on the x-axis, we have the year that we think these things will come to fruition. The y-axis is kind of like the average probability from the experts. The blue line is representing 2022's results, and the red one is 2023 results. And you see on both of these charts a nice little vertical shift. It's because these years were very good for AI ML. The one on the left is the probability of achieving high-level machine learning. So this is kind of like artificial general intelligence. The paper has a very specific definition. It's kind of saying like, when will machine learning be able to do what we consider to be like human cognition? You can see most of the probability comes around 2050 or afterwards. And so I think most people will be ending their career by then. You see on the right, we have full automation of labor. So this one kind of interacts robotics, and that 50% mark comes, probably way after I'll be dead. So interesting to think kind of where the people on the ground floor of this phenomena think things are going. Why is this relevant? Well, at Akur8, you probably know us as the software as a service company. We make a transparent AI product. And so you think that this would benefit us. And to some degree, all the hype does. People do come to us saying, we have some budget set aside for AI tools. But we're increasingly encountering these perspectives at the ends of the spectrum. And so I would say if you reduce all the perspectives in artificial intelligence to one dimension, I would say at the extremes, we have the AI skeptic and the AI fanatic. So the AI skeptic, really doesn't like talking about artificial intelligence. As soon as you bring it up, they think it's all hype. They're not interested. The AI fanatic is that person who, if it's not a digital pulsing brain, they don't consider it artificial intelligence. And maybe they want to automate all their actuaries out of a job. So this is where we're kind of thinking about it. And this is where this presentation spawned from. It's kind of catering into the middle to position AI as useful tools. A few more results from here before we move on, but it was interesting because they summarized all these different tasks, functions, professions, and they put a red dot for the 2023 average. I think it was like when it became 50%. The blue dots are 2022. And so you can see most things got pushed up between those surveys, not everything. I thought there were a few interesting observations here. So the first is that they think an AI researcher will be automated somewhere around like 2050. But they think surgeons will be automated first. So I don't know about you, seems like a little bit of professional bias in my opinion, but kind of interesting. The next one was top 40 pop songs. So this one moved up several years, and AI has made tremendous advances in making like music. I don't know if you are a Drake fan, I am, but there's this song that leaked called Heart on My Sleeve. And so it was quite a banger. It was Drake featuring Weeknd. The writing is really on the wall for that top 40 pop song. Now, technically, this one wasn't written by AI. It was just synthesized by AI, but still really interesting to think about. The next one is that the only thing on this chart that I'm really looking for was folding laundry. This was actually one of the few tests that got pushed out further. So, a little bit of bad news, but interesting to think about. I've been reassured because the Casualty Actuarial Society, which is like our preferred partner for releasing research through in the US, has put out a call for papers. And they've taken a really practical approach to this, kind of signaling that artificial intelligence is a real phenomena, but we have to be practical here and be pragmatic. And there's a call for papers, and the tone that they've taken has really kind of matched my intuition on this. So I think most people kind of fall in the middle of that spectrum, and we can agree this is definitely something to follow and potentially consequential, but maybe not like earth-changing. So that's the first section of this presentation. I want to take a little bit of a hard pivot now, and I just kind of bashed AI, but I actually made this visualization with artificial intelligence. Here's the story on this one. When I was much younger, I had epilepsy. I was in and out of the hospital for sleep studies. I was fortunate enough that I grew out of it during my adolescence. But in that time, we met a family at the hospital, and the father had epilepsy as well. And so we got to know these people, became very close with them. One day, the father was driving down a street like this, where the sun was coming through a shady street, and the flickering of the light through the branches caused him to have an accident, or a seizure, then resulting in an accident. It was really sad, but fortunately, he ended up being okay. And I was reflecting on this recently, kind of thinking, in my field now where I've worked with auto insurance, how does this change my view on this event? And so I came to two realizations. The first is that there's all this richness behind the data that gets compressed as soon as we hit the database, right? So a claim comes in, someone is summarizing it, we get a few characteristics. So much information is lost in that process. So we probably haven't hit the glass ceiling yet on predictive power, if we can extract more information from that. But the second was, as a thought experiment, what could we do differently if we knew this? So if we had infinite time to sit through every claim, read through the notes, how might we handle this differently? And so I came about this from a frequency and severity perspective. I was thinking for frequency, we would probably exclude this, right? I did a little bit of research, and there's no variable in the rating plan that even remotely correlates or has a statistical association with propensity for an epileptic event. There's nothing geographic, demographic, cultural. There's some evidence that men get it more than women. This is debated on whether this is statistically significant. But the point being that if you put that in the modeling data set, it's just going to be noise. And the records that type of event happen are just going to soak up that noise. Now, this goes into the whole debate about causality. And as you know, ASOP 12 says we don't necessarily have to use causal variables. We should. I agree with this because establishing causality is very difficult. It actually takes tons of research to do. And if we had to establish causality on everything, we would never get anything done. So think about smoking. It took many decades to say for sure that smoking causes cancer. I would argue that from a severity perspective, we probably would keep this record in. So we did learn something about the medical bills for this type of accident, how much it costs to replace that vehicle. And you might disagree. I think it's okay to have disagreeing opinions on this, but this is the type of human ingenuity that we bring to the table that the machine learning methods may not ever be able to incorporate. And you might be saying, this is a really weird example, and I agree with you. This is weird, but weird stuff happens all the time. So one of the things at Akur8 is when we don't have updates to share with our clients, there's not a whole lot going on. We give technical presentations, and I'm borrowing a slide from a technical presentation on time consistency. You might recall in 2013, there was a meteor that struck a Russian city. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of that city, but it was a devastating strike, and tons of windows broke, infrastructure was damaged, people were hurt. And the question is this city any more risky? Did we learn anything from this information? I'm going to argue, maybe from a base rate perspective, you could. I also did a little bit of research on like, are parts of the Earth more likely to get hit by meteors? Some argue it is. But from a segmentation perspective, I don't think we really learned a whole lot. So I might remove this incident overall. Now, it might feel like I'm going in the weeds here, but the whole idea is that rate making is perspective. So it's fair game to look at the past, try to derive patterns. But that transfer of risk contract, which is so unique to P&C insurance, means that we're looking forward, and we have to price everything prospectively. So these are important conversations and considerations to have when building models. Now, the question is the world predictable? And so I'm not a historian, but my understanding is that for most of our species' existence, we did think that the world was deterministic and it was predictable. There's some cause and effect relationship to everything, and we can peel that back. And so, Nostradamus is the textbook example of this, and he had a book full of prophecies. Very easy to poke fun at this now, but remember, this was the predominant viewpoint at the time. Many years later, Pierre-Simon Laplace, who was a mega genius polymath, he was thinking about this, and he had this thought experiment that we now refer to as Laplace's demon. And it was the idea that if the demon knew where all the particles in the universe were, their momentum, they could technically leverage classical mechanics to reveal the entire course of cosmic events, past and future. Now, there's not even enough energy in the universe to do this, but it's an interesting thing to think about. The problem is we've learned a few things since then. So particularly chaos theory, quantum mechanics, but even within quantum mechanics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that the world is inherently stochastic. And so small little changes can greatly change the outcome of things. Now, again, this is where the modern perspective is, the consensus opinion. So I don't want to say it with certainty that this will never change. Maybe we'll learn something new, but it is an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so it's stochastic. Can we predict it? Certainly not in the long run. So I have an example here. This was a civil servant put out a memorandum, and Donald Rumsfeld sent this to then at the time President George W. Bush. I actually want to read a few points from this. So it was thoughts for the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review. If you had been a security policymaker in the world's greatest power in 1900, you would have been a Brit, looking warily at your age-old enemy, France. By 1910, you'd be allied with France, and your enemy would be Germany. By 1920, World War I would have been fought and won, and you'd be engaged in a naval arms race with your erstwhile allies, the US and Japan. By 1930, the naval arms limitations were in effect, the Great Depression was underway, and the defense planning standard said no war for 10 years. 9 years later, World War II began. So I'm not going to read all of this. I encourage you to read it. But the point being that, if you had a trillion security analysts in Great Britain in the 1900s and you asked them to predict the next 50 years, I don't think anyone was going to get close to that, right? So in the long run, these things tend to be hard to predict. I'd point you to the bottom where he says, all of which is to say that I'm not sure what 2010 will look like, but I'm sure that it will be very little like we expect, and we should plan accordingly. So kind of a clever, witty end to the paper, but then I point you to the date. So this was from April 12th, 2001, a few months before September 11th, which was surely a very consequential day and changed the course of what might have happened. Okay, so the nature of the world is stochastic. It's probably unpredictable in the long run. So what are we doing here? And I want to thank Dominic Lee, who's an ACAS. He goes by the Maverick Actuary, great content creator on LinkedIn. And he had this meme, which is just perfect. So I appreciate him saying I could put this into my presentation. And so the idea here is, maybe we're not predicting the future, but we're using statistics and data to build distributions and estimations, just so in the long run, on average, we can be a little less wrong, right? So I think this is the right way to think about it, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but potentially we can do better on average than previously. What's really interesting is that insurance professionals and specifically actuaries have been thinking about this from this perspective for at least 100 years, probably longer. And more recently, this has become very popular, right? So you've seen a ton of books that try to capture this probabilistic thinking in ranges of outcomes. And it's very popular in like general people are now starting to think about this. Here's my argument to you, going back to the meteors and the seizures, is that just as people are starting to think like us now, we are also starting to borrow from other groups. So the experienced modelers on the call were probably saying, when I was talking about the seizure, we have tools for this. We have regularization, we have test train splits, we have cross validation. So we have tools to make sure that we're not picking up on all that noise, and we could build robust models. And I agree with you. However, those methods have been in machine learning and computer science since the 40s and 60s. They went mainstream between the 70s and 80s. It wasn't probably until like 10 years ago they started to get adopted in insurance modeling. So there are things out there that we can use to leverage from other disciplines to build better models. So first part of this presentation is kind of just a state of AI ML. The second one is kind of introducing the stochastic nature and what the modeler can do to think about building better models. And now I actually want to talk about that for the rest of the presentation. How can we build better models? And this is more of a conceptual presentation. I'll be giving some more technical presentations soon. So I want you to think abstractly and probably inspire you to start thinking about how you can do this. I don't have any concrete ideas, but I have some things that might interest you to kind of get you thinking about what comes next. So the first is, if you've ever seen this book, The Signal and the Noise by Nate Silver, it came out about 10 years ago. I was rereading this recently, and it is very interesting how this book really outlines the modern data science perspective, right? The way that most of us who are experienced modelers tend to think about modeling is really captured in this book. So if you're a new modeler or you want to get into it, I definitely recommend this book. It will get you up to speed very quickly. The good news is we've adopted most of the things that are outlined in this text, but there are a few things that we probably could be doing that we haven't done yet. And so, for example, in the book, he talks about weather forecasts. Now, I'm 36. I have not experienced this joke, but apparently back in the day, there was a big joke that weather forecasts are always wrong. They're just guessing. And the reason I haven't experienced that in my lifetime is because weather models have actually come a very long way, and to the point where they're highly calibrated. So here you can see forecast against the observed frequency, and weather forecasts these days tend to be very accurate. The question is, how did they get so accurate? Now, most of it is the things that have benefited us, like machine learning methods, advances in computer technology and hardware. But there were some things that they included that we weren't doing, and I think this is pretty interesting. The idea was that even though they're building a stochastic model, they try to incorporate as many deterministic things as possible. So for example, in physics models, chemistry models, you might be modeling some sort of phenomena that you can't describe exactly, but you know that there are a whole bunch of deterministic things that you can build in. So for example, if you give me some molecules and you tell me the temperature and the pressure, I can tell you almost exactly what phase of matter it's in. It tends to be largely explained by those two dimensions. So, if you're a vapor and you cross this blue line, you'll turn into a liquid phase. So while the phenomena that we're modeling is stochastic, adding as much determinism into it can improve the model. How are we going to do this in insurance? Well, I have two examples for you. I'm going to mention telematics a few times in this presentation. I know not everyone is in telematics, but telematics tends to be on the cutting edge of insurance data science. Here's the idea. We all kind of have this view in our head that speeding is bad, fast drivers are dangerous. What we've actually found from telematics is that slow drivers are also dangerous. So people who consistently drive below the speed limit tend to be hazards on the road. Other people aren't expecting you to drive like that. So if we built an insurance model, it would probably penalize these people who are consistently driving slow. But as soon as we have this telematics data with location and time, we can join on the weather characteristics that were observed at that time when you were driving. And the idea here is if you were in a consistently wet or icy area, maybe you're driving slow for a reason. So we don't want to penalize you for driving slow because you're probably just responding to the weather conditions. This is a great way to add a little bit of boost to your models. The other is, and I don't recommend that anyone do this yet because this would be a ton of work, but maybe large language models will make this more accessible, is that a lot of property insurance and commercial property is dictated by things that happen through building codes, right? So in the 80s and 90s, there were all these pushes to have sprinkler systems and taller buildings. Some buildings got grandfathered in, some didn't. And so if you knew something about the zoning and the building codes, you'd probably have some more information about the risk of that building. So again, really hard to go out and collect that information. So again, I'm not saying that you should do that. but there is some sort of deterministic element that theoretically could be captured. Now, this is just auto and property. It'd be really interesting to see how this could apply to your line of business. So how would you do this with cybersecurity or traveler's insurance, right? D&O, how could you bring in some more deterministic elements into your line of business? The next is adding more determinism to our models with things that we already have. So a lot of the times we're working with truncated data. The data that we're collecting can't fully capture the model that we're trying to, or the phenomena that we're trying to model, because below a certain threshold, people won't report the losses. And so there's techniques to do this where you might model ground up losses. You might use the deductible factors as offsets. And I was thinking about this recently, that one of those probably has more information than the other, right? Using the deductibles for offsets probably captures some information about severity and frequency, whereas the ground up losses might just have more information about severity. I was speaking with my chief actuary about this, and he had a good point that it probably really depends on the peril or the coverage that you're modeling. So maybe for fire insurance, this probably doesn't offer any lift. But again, it's just using the data that we currently have to add more determinism. Okay, so when we're building machine learning methods for segmentation, very specific, right? So if you're in reserving, some of this will still apply. If you just work on base rate needs, some will still apply. But I'd say if you're doing segmentation, there's four main tools we have at our disposal. So the first is the traditional actuarial methods, like loss ratio relativity analyses. These are more empirical, and they come with their own considerations. You may have seen these in like basic rate making 5th edition. So we're just going to summarize the data that we've collected. It's not a statistical component, and it comes with its own considerations. I put out a webinar, maybe 6 months ago, where I kind of went into the considerations for this method. I'm not a big fan, to be perfectly honest with you, but this is still very popular. The next is the Me Too filing. So for our friends outside of the US, the backstory is we have to publish our rates here in the US for most lines of business. So you can go see your competitor's loss model and their pricing factors, and you could potentially build it into your own or just keep a pulse on what they're doing. I actually am a big fan of these, right? I think it's useful to see what people are doing, and we'll talk about that in the subsequent slides. But these two come with their own considerations. And I'll say at the spring meeting, I'm giving a presentation called The Art of the Rating Plan, where I actually show how someone could weaponize their rating plan with the anticipation that there will be people copying their rates. The next is exercising professional judgment. Now, there's a huge push in the actuarial discipline to fight modeler bias. And I agree with this, right? Humans have these biases, and that's an important thing to factor in. However, we shouldn't be trying to get rid of professional judgment. I think you'd be surprised if you open up a machine learning textbook, they often talk about domain knowledge, because there's some information that's in the data that can't be captured solely from that quantitative component, and the modeler can bring that in. In reinforcement learning, the stuff behind ChatGPT, right? We use rewards to program the machine learning models, and that's a representation of our domain knowledge. Here I have an example with trampoline surcharge. So when I was in property pricing, the trampoline surcharge would always come back as some astronomical factor of 2.0. And we knew that this was probably not prospective. It was just due to some bad loss experience. So we might override the model with a selection. The next is the machine learning methods. Now, these are predominantly becoming the tools that we use, even if you don't have a ton of data. And I want to spend a lot of time on this, but we're talking about things like the generalized linear models, the tree-based ensembles, and these are great, but they come with their own considerations. So these last three items here, the Me Too filings, exercising professional judgment, and machine learning models, I want to talk about those in the subsequent slides. So the first is the wisdom of the crowds, right? So the wisdom of the crowds is actually a very interesting phenomenon. It says if you have a bunch of actors who provide a guess on something, if you take the average of those, it tends to be very correct. Really interesting, but the idea here is that everyone is operating with different information. There's a counterpart to this called the madness of crowds, or herding. And this is the idea that we tend to herd, even if information is coming in that runs counter to our opinion, and we don't want to go against the group. So an example of the wisdom of the crowds would be kind of like the stock market, right? The stock market in the long run, on average, tends to be efficient. It tends to reflect all the information in the marketplace, and it tends to be hard to beat the market after accounting for taxes and fees. However, there was an example recently where we were getting reports out of China about a novel coronavirus, and the stock market in the US wasn't budging for months. And so you think with every headline, the probability of a 1 in 100 year pandemic would increase and we would see the stock market tick down, but that actually didn't happen, right? No one wanted to jump first until one day it just tanked. So when we're looking at other people's rates or talking in teams about what we should be doing, we should be aware of these things. Oh, let me just mention too, I used artificial intelligence to make these plots, and the one on the right is truly jarring. But moving on. So there was this book, Super Forecasting, and you might have heard of groupthink, and they have a really good section on this, the backstory of this. So JFK, as you might have heard during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was some operation where all his advisors told him this was going to go very well. Turned out it didn't. And so, you know, the whole story that we kind of tell in pop culture is that humans tend to kind of like merge their thinking into one consensus opinion. And this is called groupthink. If you read the book, though, they actually show that the administration learned from this. So they observed this and they put in rules and guidelines to help mitigate against this in the future. Part of that was developing a culture of scrutiny. So, you know, kind of empowering people to disagree, think differently from the group. And this is how investment committees at hedge funds work, right? You're going to submit your views to people who are going to think critically of them. And it's not to bash anyone, but it's just to make sure that we're not subjecting ourselves to groupthink. Maybe you've heard of the Ash conformity experiments. I don't have enough time to go deeply into it, but Solomon Ash was interested in like, how do groups conform? So he set up these experiments where he would go around the table, ask everyone a question that was very obvious, but everyone except the last person was in on it. And everyone before that last person would answer with a very obviously wrong answer. And what he found was that an alarming number of people would actually provide the wrong answer when they got to the end. And when they did some research afterwards asking, why did you give the wrong answer? They just said they didn't want to go against the group. So it's almost like this is against our nature to disagree with groups. And that might actually be true. Greg Burns and some researchers put out a paper a few years ago that tried to recreate this, but look at brain activity. And what they found was that when someone is in one of these situations, their amygdala lights up. The amygdala is often described as the part of the brain responsible for fear, fight or flight. So it literally might be against our nature to go against a group. So this means it's something that you have to actively work on. And if you're leading a group of modelers, you might want to encourage this. I'm going to do a little bit of fighting social conformity on my own. And I want to talk about GLMs versus GBMs. So the first thing I would say is that there's this misconception that GLMs aren't artificial intelligence or machine learning. I have no idea where this came from. If you open up any AI ML textbook, even deep learning textbooks, they're going to talk about linear models and their variance. So I'm not sure why folks think this isn't, but again, I would reference these textbooks if you disagree. That one textbook on the right actually has a whole section about linear models, and then it has a whole section on generalized linear models. So these models are amazing. And this is where I get to, you know, if I was giving this presentation live, I can usually see who's an AI skeptic or AI fanatic, because for some reason, this tends to rub them the wrong way. The AI skeptic wants to preserve the purity of GLMs and say it's like a statistical concept. The AI fanatic says this isn't a digital pulsing brain. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit for the effect of the presentation. But again, I think there is this view that these methods are not artificial intelligence, and I just don't agree. GLMs are amazing. If you have some sort of statistical assumption of likelihood that falls into the exponential dispersion family, the GLM is really unrivaled for this. And fortunately, in insurance, that tends to be the case. Frequency, severity, and pure premium we can model with these distributions. The backstory was that, you know, we had all these different types of regression, linear regression, logistic, Poisson, and then some geniuses figured out we can actually abstract the process and generalize it to unify all these into one framework. Then what happened is we started making variants to this, like penalized regression, GAMs with automatic feature engineering, Bayesian methods. Then we made variants to the variants that are very cutting edge. So a lot of the things that we like about GBMs, like the automatic feature selection, automatic feature engineering, those are incorporated in things like derivative lasso and AGLM. If you're interested more in GLMs, we don't have time to go into the mechanics, but I would point you to CAS Monograph 5. I've referenced this text so many times in my career. Our friend Dave Clark over at Munich Re also has a newer paper called GLM for Dummies. And what I like about this one is it gets more into like the mechanics under the hood. Now, GBMs are also amazing. I don't want it to come off like in these next few slides that I don't like GBMs. GBMs are very powerful, and they're an amazing tool in the toolkit. The magic of GBMs, in my opinion, is the boosting, right? Some people think it's the trees. You have these, short depth, weak learners that you ensemble together. Those parts are cool, but it's actually the boosting. Now, if you go read a machine learning textbook on boosting, it's probably, arguably, one of the most magical things in machine learning. So I highly encourage you to check that out. And again, I don't have time to go into the mechanics, but I just don't want it to sound like I'm bashing GBMs. These are very useful tools. Here's where I'm going with all this. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I go there for a lot of research. And within that subset of AI fanatics, there's definitely a group of GBM fanatics who are all over my timeline on LinkedIn. I don't know why I see so much of this, but I see a lot of oversimplifications that are evolving into myths. So the first is that GLMs are primitive and require manual feature engineering, where the GBMs are automatic. That might have been true 15 years ago, but again, we're on the variance of the variance. So all those things about the GBM that we like are captured in more modern methods. The next is that boosting never overfits, and GBMs always outperform GLMs. I have no idea where this came from. Now, boosting, again, is amazing, but GBMs, when you're using the tree-based ensembles, are overfitting machines. Every time I've ever built a GBM, the majority of the time is spent from overfitting. And also, again, I think the predictive power gap has really been narrowed, right? It's really in special search situations where you have this data with high interaction propensity. So again, maybe like telematics, that's where you tend to see the GBMs outperform, but even then the performance gap has been narrowed significantly. And finally is that SHAP values make GBMs transparent. Now, again, not bashing SHAP values. SHAP values are actually very cool. It's a game theoretic way of establishing variable importance. And what's nice about it is that it's model agnostic. So you can use it with a GLM or a GBM. It's very computationally intensive, but I want to make a distinction here. These might make it more explainable or interpretable, but not transparent. And I'm going to explain why that's important in a moment. I don't want to get into a whole semantics debate, but you'll see why. The first thing I'll mention, though, is that there was a paper that kind of challenged the role of variable importance and some of the inadequacy of SHAP values. So if you think my opinions are strong, just know that there's even stronger ones out there. But the idea is that a variable can be unimportant on average up until it is really important. And this is very common in behavioral science, right? In certain situations, a variable can become very important on those records, and just, pushing it out of the model because on average, it's not important, probably not a best practice. But going back to the transparency, right? GLMs are unrivaled in transparency. And this is why you often see them mentioned in those machine learning textbooks, and particularly the deep learning textbook. GLM gives you all this information and just pops out. So variable importance, but also how those variables behave in a particular dimension. So what you're looking at is an example with auto frequency. Driver age is on the x-axis, frequency is on the y-axis, and you see this shape that kind of matches our intuition, except that the 90-year-olds are getting the same factor as the 70-year-olds. We know that at some point your age starts working against you. So you tend to see this parabolic curve there. This was COVID data. So maybe the 90-year-olds weren't driving. And so in our data, this is not representing what's going to happen in the future. And what's beautiful about the GLMs is that not only can we see this, it just comes right out of the GLM, but also we have the ability to override it and blend in our domain knowledge by just changing the factors for that section. Okay, so some might argue, well, you can do this with GBMs. You can use ICE plots, PDPs. Yeah, technically you can. You can do a whole bunch of work to reverse engineer the GBMs to get something that just pops out of the GLMs, and then you'll see this. And the question is, what are you going to do? It would be very difficult to sit there and edit the trees. I've never even heard of someone doing that. So this is why I think building these types of models in conjunction with GLMs is very important. You know what's interesting? The best models in insurance that I've built were not GLMs, they were not GBMs, they were k-nearest neighbors models. Now, no one needs to remember how these work. I'll briefly explain it. I'm going to make a point here. And I don't encourage you to go out and build a k-nearest neighbors model either. This was for research purposes, but these are a nightmare to implement. It's an example of instance-based learning, so you'd have to upload the whole modeling data set to implement this. But here's an example from one of my machine learning graduate courses where you see all these dots that represent real estate values. All k-nearest neighbors is going to do is say, I might just look at the closest examples in the data set to predict what this value is worth, right? And so you do this with a whole bunch of distance measures, right? So the challenge with k-nearest neighbors is defining distance across the hyperdimensional data, but it feels very natural, right? If I just told you to point on this plot and tell me how much you think something is worth, you'd probably look at the neighbors around it. Why am I bringing this up if I'm telling you you're never going to build this type of model? What I find interesting about this is that it kind of suggests that class-based modeling still works. What do I mean by this? So if you read Basic Rate Making 5th edition, the idea here is that individually, we are all our own selves. We all behave very differently. And theoretically, we want to rate the individual instead of the class. And by the class, I just mean the group of characteristics that you fit into. People don't like being rated as a class, but in insurance, it's usually the best we can do. But the thought was that maybe as we move to telematics, we can start picking up on those individual differences and move away from the class-based modeling. And we're actually seeing some challenges to this. So again, don't want to spend too much time on telematics because not everyone works in this. But I would define, like telematics 1.0 was those OBD2 devices, telematics 2.0 was the mobile apps. And what we saw was that when we layered on the telematics models, the original kind of core rating variables stayed in the model and their shapes were largely the same. So this suggested that all the things that we're picking up on were residual to those classes, and class-based modeling might still have some relevance. Now, there's also some suggestion that this might be changing, right? So telematics 3.0, and these are made-up terms, I'm just using them loosely. I would say this is the connected vehicle. So you're getting all this high-frequency telematics data with all the sensors. This is where we get really high-fidelity data. The next is telematics 4.0. This is like using dash cam footage. And this is really interesting because now you can start to contextualize certain events. So for example, you might have had a close call. And so this was describing the telematics data that you saw. And so maybe as we start getting this higher fidelity data, we will move away from the class-based modeling. Maybe we won't. Now the telematics stuff comes with its own consideration. The amount of data that you get explodes, so it can be very expensive to collect and then parse through. I will say what's really interesting about the dash cam footage is that now you can start to look at maybe like fractional frequency. So we just talked about the close calls. Close call, you could probably say, well, that wasn't an event, but probabilistically it could have been. So you can say this was like a fractional claim count. So really interesting to think about. And again, the whole point of this presentation is this is the ingenuity that the human brings to the table. Oops, here we go. Okay, the last topic I have for you, challenging homogeneity. Everyone knows this concept if you've been in the actuarial field, pricing, reserving, we all use this. The question is the data homogeneous enough to be modeled together? We usually don't have a ton of data, so we want to group things. And so the textbook example is in property insurance, we have like standard homes that we insure, we call those HO3, then we have these high valued homes, HO5. If we split them up, we probably don't have enough data to model HO5 or do the triangles for. So we often group them together and we say, we're sacrificing a little bit of homogeneity because we have to. This is a huge part in actuarial science, but in machine learning, they're starting to challenge this idea of homogeneity using something called transfer learning. Here's the idea. When you go to learn something, your brain doesn't start from scratch. So for example, if you were going to learn an instrument, the pathways, the neural pathways in your brain that light up are those for like language, right? So your brain is learning from things that it's already learned before. Those neural structure ways help us take on new tasks. We don't learn from scratch. And so here's an example. If you were going to build a learner to detect cats, you had a whole bunch of data to detect cats, you go and do that. Then you have to go build a learner to predict airplanes, and you don't have a ton of data. The thought is, these things are so different that we'd have to start from scratch, and we'll just have to accept the fact that we don't have a ton of data. But what transfer learning has showed us is that actually you had to learn a lot of things to learn the cats, like lines and edges, and those can be applied to detecting airplanes. So the standard way we do this is we chop off the last layer, we retrain the weights up until that layer of the deep learner, and this tends to work really well. And I'll show you an example in a moment. Why does this work though, right? And if this is so powerful, why aren't we using this in insurance pricing? Well, deep learning tends to thrive when there's a hierarchical composition to the data. And so, you might have these low-level features like lines and edges. Then you have these mid-level features like eyes, nose, and ears. And then we put it together, and the high-level features are the facial structures, right? So this is what those layers in the deep learning are doing. They're doing feature extraction, and they're building up the composition from low level to high level. And so there's a paper that you should go check out. It actually has an interactive website called Taskonomy. And so this is from Stanford. But what they showed was if they built a bunch of deep learning models for like different visual tasks, that was really interesting to see how well those things would transfer to other things. So for example, like 3D going into like 2.5D segmentation, those tended to work really well. And not everything would transfer very well, but it was interesting to see that actually it kind of matched our intuition, right? If you were learning like the lines and the edges, where would that be useful in learning depth? This paper is a little bit above me, so I still encourage you to read it, but very interesting. How are we going to use this in our field if deep learning is not the way to build insurance models? Well, we've actually been working with our clients on this in many capacities. And what's interesting is that transfer learning fits really well into the GLM framework, very similar to offsets. So maybe you're familiar with offsets, right? This hard offset idea is we're going to take some things that we know, maybe the deductibles, lock those in, and then fit the parameters to what's left over, the residuals. Soft offsets might be like a Bayesian prior for the parameters. So we kind of give it a starting point, and then we penalize as we move away. So we're modeling the credible differences. So this is really good for using like a prior model as a starting point for a new model. We would often call this like a refit. And again, we're going to use those parameters from the prior model and penalize the difference as we move away from it. What's more interesting is like state-specific refits. This is something where we've been very active with our clients. The idea here is that when I was in homeowners insurance, we would always go to the state managers with our models and then say, I don't care if you build a countrywide model, but I need my own coverage A curve. My state is different than that state, so I need my own coverage A curve. And we have to tell them, I can't put a 50-way interaction with state and coverage A in there. It's chopping up the data way too thin, and we're going to overfit. The model is already accounting for these multivariate relationships between these things, and that never really resonated with them well. So what we're starting to see is like if we start with the countrywide model, and then we use that as the offset for a state-specific model, what we can do is model the credible differences from the countrywide model for that state. And our chief actuary and principal scientist are putting out a monograph with the Casualty Actuarial Society called Lasso Credibility that actually shows this is analogous to a credibility procedure. Finally, something more exotic, right? Like, I don't think you're going to be using like the cybersecurity model for the D&O model, but maybe we can use the personal auto for the commercial auto. Now, I know some places have tried this before and it hasn't been that successful, but maybe we were just doing it the wrong way. So maybe in this framework, we can do it. All that's really needed to leverage transfer learning in your machine learning models is that the inputs have to be largely similar. Okay, so wrapping up here, I want to do some Q&A. I will say, when you see my face on LinkedIn and me presenting, it's really easy to give me all the credit, but I actually have a really good team here at Akur8, a whole bunch of data science folks that help me put together these presentations, but also a whole sales and marketing team that helps me promote the heck out of these. The idea here being that, we put out some research, we get a little goodwill, maybe people come to check out Akur8, and we can reinvest that in more research. And I'll say, Olga, who's my graphics designer, I give her some of the messiest slides ever. She puts them together so nice and clean. So if you like how these slides look, I would thank her. Also, Heidi and Nicole, who help with marketing, they're actually on the call with me. They do a lot to promote these and get some attention for these presentations. Before we do Q&A, a few other things. So if you're going to the spring meeting, we actually have a number of presentations. There's one called Demystifying Artificial Intelligence, which is very much a successor to this. So when I put this presentation together, I had like 3 hours of content. And in this presentation, I kept all the conceptual stuff. And in that presentation, I put together all the technical stuff. We're also giving one called The Art of the Rating Plan. So when I was talking about that idea of weaponizing the rating plan, if someone was looking at your Me Too filings, I explain how you can defend against that. So definitely encourage you to check that out. And if you're not going to be attending, that will be in the live stream. Don't feel like you have to memorize this. If you message me on LinkedIn, I can share the slides. Few other things I want to promote. Don't want to do too much promotion here, but we actually have some good ones coming up. So my counterpart in the UK office, Edwin Graham, is putting one together called How to Build New Products Using Akur8. And if you can't attend that spring meeting, we'll be giving the Demystifying Artificial Intelligence in June through Akur8 Academy. One last thing, I know it's so many, but if you are a member of the Casualty Actuarial Society, we're giving a few webinars with them soon. So derivative lasso, credibility-based signal fitting for GLMs. This was that variant of the variant that I was talking about. So Mattia Casoto, who's our principal scientist, and I will be giving this presentation. And then that Art of the Rating Plans one, if you don't catch the live stream, we'll be giving that through Akur8 Academy. Oh, I'm sorry, what the CAS is a webinar. Okay, so ton of information, a lot of slides, moving fast. We have a whole bunch of time set aside for Q&A, so feel free to drop those in. And I see a few things already. Okay, so this one is more of a chat. I'll have to check that out. Oh, it's from Dave Clark, our friend over at Munich Re. So he said he just pre-ordered a book saying everything is predictable. So this is definitely something I'll have to add to my reading list. Every time this guy gives me a recommendation, it's phenomenal. So Dave Clark, highly recommend you follow him on LinkedIn. Let's see. So no questions have come in yet. This is often the case. People are pretty shy. Feel free to shoot them in. The one thing I'll mention is if folks are typing, so that SHAP values paper, it's a really interesting paper. And, you know, again, kind of like it goes into why SHAP values might be delivering on what this expectation of them is. Now, again, I don't bash the SHAP values. They're very cool. Again, if you want to bring some interpretability to some of the more black box models, probably the main tool in the toolkit. Very computationally intensive. And I don't agree with all the conclusions in that paper. But one of the big topics of machine learning is this idea of the myth of variable importance, right? So maybe variable importance, again, from that behavioral science standpoint, it really doesn't mean what we think it is. The backstory on this is going back to information theory, which we talked about at the beginning. In information theory, you're usually trying to balance the predictiveness of the model against the complexity. So, you know, it's kind of like the Occam's razor view on things. Like, we're willing to make the model more complex if it can add predictive power, but all things held constant, if we had two models that are behaving similarly from a predictive standpoint, we'd prefer a simpler model. And so what it's trying to say in that SHAP value context is that we're kind of challenging that view, right? Because again, something can be insignificant up until it isn't. And so really interesting paper, very strong views, very popular though. So I think it has got some traction, but definitely one of the things I would recommend that you take away from this is to check out that paper. Again, a little bit of the mathematics sometimes are a bit above my pay grade. Mattia Casoto, again, who's our principal scientist, tends to be very technical, and he helps me when some of this stuff is beyond me. But I think you can still read that more conceptually and get some information from it. So no questions. I can just keep freestyling if you want. One of the interesting things that we gave this presentation once with the Casualty Actuarial Society, and it was kind of talking about that idea of you know, bringing in that scrutiny within the modeling teams to kind of challenge views. This is kind of hard to do, especially when everyone is really busy. It's hard to kind of set up those model reviews, and oftentimes, you know, when we challenge the models, we know that there's not a whole lot of time to go back and just start from scratch and incorporate those changes. So there's a way to balance this, right? We can document our assumptions, we can document concerns, but we don't have to do so in a way that's bashing anyone or, you know, saying that we have to like redo the models. We know that some models are, well, all models are wrong, some models are useful. But again, it's that idea of just kind of keeping our heads up, being aware of what some of these assumptions are. We did get some questions come in. Pretty basic question. You talked about hierarchical learning based on lines and edges and stuff. I'm not sure what the question is. Okay, wait, hold on, I think. Okay, sorry, more questions came in. Could an analogy for P&C be learning about like building features, laws, and inflation? Okay, so it was two-parter. Yeah, definitely. So I don't want it to make it sound like there isn't a hierarchical composition to our data. It tends to be just out of convention on how we collect these things. But we're always trying to, add more dimensionality to our data and bring in these new features. And I certainly agree, right? There is the potential for this deeper compositional nature to our data. Insurance data tends to be very low fidelity, and that's not to say that it will always be. We certainly can add more, and there are a lot of vendors who are trying to do this, and they'll happily sell you that data for a pretty penny. Tends to be very expensive. But I was talking to my friend DJ over at Lemonade, and he kind of was getting at this as well, right? Like there's kind of like more to this potentially due to zoning, and zoning might influence how this was built with the composition of the structure, and how people interact with it. So there's definitely more to be had here. It's just really hard to get that. And so while I don't think deep learning is necessarily the right tool in the toolkit now, there are people who think that the tools in deep learning could be used eventually. And so one of the ideas here is like auto encoding, which is kind of like unsupervised learning. Maybe that could be used for reducing like the complexity of high cardinality categorical variables. Hopefully that answers, but I think there's just a ton of work to be done to get to that level. It's probably valuable, right? We know it's an arms race for prediction and insurance, just a lot of work. How would you apply transfer learning to monitoring? So I think this question is asking about model monitoring. Yeah, model monitoring is really interesting because this is like the next frontier for actuaries, I think. We don't see a ton of it now, probably because of just the limitations of the current technology stack. But in many machine learning disciplines, this is a huge thing, right? You have to do anomaly detection. You have to see if there's parameter drift. So at Akur8, we do work on this model monitoring concept, and we try to contextualize when it's time to update things. And so the nice thing about transfer learning is that you can do it two ways. You can say, let's fit the model from scratch on the new data, but we can also fit a refit model, using the old model as the starting point, retrain it, and then we can contextualize drift that way. Now, most of the times you get to a very similar answer, but it is interesting when these things tend to disagree. I would say, it's a shame that we couldn't have tested this around like COVID, but I actually think in that situation, the transfer learning probably would have performed worse because so much was changing. But in a period of like stability, maybe not like now because there's still a whole lot of trends that are accelerating. We might trust the transfer learning method for the model monitoring more. But again, try it both ways. Another question. There's a theoretical idea that error from model comes from two sources: error from the predictor and epsilon, error from the noise. Overfitting is considered the result of a model removing error from both the predictor and noise. Is this concept being disputed with the newer methods? Is the error from the noise still considered insurmountable? This goes a little bit more into the philosophy of it. And actually, I would even zoom out a little bit. If you go read some of the actuarial standards of practice from 10 years ago on models, they have a really weird view that's probably not meshing well with like the machine learning side. They talk about like parameter risk. It was just a very different thing. And so this question is kind of now getting at how are we viewing error? Because again, it used to be kind of like things that we can't pick up on, and then some sort of like intractable error, or not intractable, but some sort of error that we can never account for. So if you've ever seen a graph of the model versus variance, model variance versus bias trade-off. The idea here is that there's some optimal point that we can get to, but then there's still some error that we can't reduce any further. And some algorithms tend to be better than others, but theoretically, there's some sort of noise there. This is actually being challenged. And so there's this concept with the double dip. I forget the exact name of it. So if you message me on LinkedIn, I can tell you about it. But there's an interactive paper out there that goes into this double dip in the variance versus bias trade-off in deep learning models, where at some point it gets so bad because it like memorizes the model, but then it starts to generalize pretty well. So yes, there's definitely something going on there. And potentially, again, it's just getting more data, right? Now, or higher, not necessarily more data, but higher fidelity data. So if we can get higher fidelity data, we can probably pick up on these things. To some degree, I'm not sure where I fall on this because, again, I've worked with some high frequency telematic stuff and it definitely improved the models, but probably not enough to justify the massive investment in collecting that data, the pipelines to assess it and analyze it. There is some suggestion that, our improvement is logarithmic, right? So like it will go to, theoretically it can like go to 1.0, right? Eventually we could get there. It's just very expensive to kind of get that lift. But again, I think that's kind of one of the interesting things that we'll see. Unfortunately, and not to knock the generative AI stuff, the generative AI stuff is getting all the attention. It's sucking all the air out of the room. So some of these more core machine learning ideas were kind of, left on the table. But hopefully that's some sort of answer to your question. I definitely encourage you to go look at that double dip, the bias versus variance trade-off with the deep learning paper. Again, it's like an interactive website where you can actually read through, and they did a very good job on making it visual where you can see what's going on. More questions. Regarding notions on telematics and driving, the too fast, too slow indicator is relative to other drivers at the same time and place. How would a model incorporate this? Or is this an example of how humans are still necessary? We hope. Amazing question. Yes. So actually, if we were to talk about what telematics 5.0 is, and remember those things that I put on that one slide, these are not real terms, telematic 1.0, telematics 2.0. But I would actually think telematics 5.0 is exactly what this question is getting at, right? Your driving is part of, the environment, what you're seeing environmentally, your own driving skills, your attention span, but also how other drivers are interacting with you. And again, theoretically, self-driving cars have not tried to have this kind of like ant colony approach to driving. They've tried to just say, if we assume that not every other driver is connected to us and we're not connected to the road, can we make autonomous vehicles? But theoretically, if these vehicles were interacting with each other and the roads, you could do way better. So yeah, I 100% think this is what telematics 5.0 is having like connected vehicles talking with each other. There's a whole branch of, I don't know if it's, I guess it's technically machine learning, but in randomized optimization and kind of the mix of machine learning, the ant colony idea, where these things are like learning from the other learners, right? They're a bunch of micro learners that are learning from each other. So yeah, I really think that would potentially provide some lift, but again, hugely expensive. And this is why, the human brain computationally is like so far ahead of supercomputers. Don't get me wrong, supercomputers are really good at things, and you can have like trillions of gigabytes of memory. But just the human mind's ability to like pick up on all these little things is unrivaled. And so the amount of sensors that you have to put into a vehicle, as well as the hardware for these things to communicate with many other vehicles, we're probably a few decades away from that. But yeah, I really like this question. I do think that's an excellent point, and that's probably where things are going. Someone said Laplace's dash cam. Yeah, I think whoever that was, you should coin that, and I think that would go viral on LinkedIn. Again, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I use it to connect with people, share ideas. I think it's a great place. There's so much, if we were to talk about noise, there's so much noise on LinkedIn. And recently I was just kind of posting about how I feel like 20% of the posts I see are written by large language models, but I still think there's a lot of value on LinkedIn. And so Ronald Richman, who's the chief actuary of Old Mutual, he's very active. He shares a lot of research. A bunch of the CAS researchers share research, and that's how I keep a pulse on where things are going. And I think even though there's a whole bunch of noise with large language models, potentially getting involved in the conversation is good for the community. Actuarial science and insurance data science is so small. I mean, it feels like there's many of us, but it's a really niche concept. And so, to some degree, while we're all competing with each other, the thing I like about the Casualty Actuarial Society is the centroid in the US is for the information sharing. And this is what drives a lot of the innovation. So we can still have our own trade secrets, our own initiatives internally, but to the extent that we want to share things and kind of push the community forward, I really think that's how you can win in insurance, is like staying part of the conversation and up to date on all these things. Great question. So the Q&A is kind of leveled off here. Give it maybe one more moment. But yeah, again, I would definitely look forward to connecting with you on LinkedIn. These are the types of conversations I really like to have, and definitely appreciate any thoughts that you have on the presentation. I have a very unique presentation style, as I'm told, where we kind of move fast and have a lot of information. Some people like this, some people don't, and I'd definitely be interested in your feedback because that kind of helps me tailor the message and how I share this information. I will say that this presentation that we have coming up with the Casualty Actuarial Society and then Akur8 Academy called Demystifying Artificial Intelligence, kind of a fluffy name, but there is a lot of information in that. It's actually got the most slides I've ever put into a presentation, and I've had to like start memorizing what I'm saying so I can move the pace of the presentation forward. But if you thought this one was good, it was just maybe too conceptual for you. That one is probably the presentation for you. It gets way more technical. And I reference a whole lot of kind of the classical artificial intelligence as well as some of the cutting edge stuff straight from a bunch of papers. But at this point, I'm just biding my time doing my monologue. So if there's no more questions, we can call that a wrap. And I will say that we will eventually put this on YouTube so you can watch the recording. And if you want to share it with your team, we'd greatly appreciate that. I will say it's interesting. We didn't get any questions about Bayesian GLMs. That's actually the first time in an Akur8 Academy presentation we didn't get a question about the Bayesian methods, which again, I think are great. They're just really computationally intensive. And the nice thing is that you get kind of that distribution on the priors. But again, we've kind of moved past that and we have this new generation of modeling. And so I really encourage you to check out the derivative lasso paper and the AGLM paper. The author of AGLM, or the main author, Suguru, actually works at Akur8 now. And it's really interesting to kind of contrast that against the derivative lasso paper because they both get at automated feature engineering and automated feature selection, all those things we love about the GBM in the GLM framework, but they do it a little bit differently. So really interesting to check out. We will be giving that presentation on the derivative lasso methodology with the Casualty Actuarial Society in July. So hopefully you can check that out. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share if there's no more questions. But yeah, thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. Again, if you can shoot us your thoughts, that would be greatly appreciated.